get up and crawl away. And yet, when you think about it, all the bits of the frog are there, aren't they? But unless they're all together in the right place at the right time, the way they're supposed to be, it's not going to work. Just like a machine, just like a 747. You know what is fascinating? Not only is life like that when you consider our body, you know, everything has to be all there at the right place, the right time to make it work, like a mosquito, like a frog. But when we get down into the biochemistry of a cell, into the very inner workings of a cell, you know what we find? There's really, literally, in a sense, thousands of 747s to make life work. There's a man called Dr. Michael Behe. He's not a biblical creationist like me, but he's professor of biochemistry at a university in America, and he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And in that book, what he was saying was this. You know, for instance, give you an example. Just for an organism to sense light and turn it into electrical impulses, takes this chemical and this one 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 and this one, page after page after page, all these chemicals, all the right place, all the right concentration, all the right time, right at the right location, all together, or it won't work. You know what that's called? A biochemical machine. And you know, for life to work, you've got thousands and thousands of these biochemical machines. In other words, you've got to start with machines. So do you know what Dr. Behe says? You've got to believe in God. You can't believe in chance random processes because life has to start with machines. In fact, there's a couple of very interesting quotes from his book, Darwin's Black Box. He says this: "Now it's a turn of the fundamental science of life, modern biochemistry, to disturb. The simplicity that was once expected to be a foundation of life has proven to be a phantom. Instead, systems of horrendous, irreducible complexity inhabit the cell. The resulting realization that life was designed by an intelligence is a shock to us in the 20th century who have gotten used to thinking of life as a result of simple natural laws." Well, it's not a shock to me, being a creationist, of course. In the beginning, God created. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But other centuries have had their shocks, and there is no reason to suppose that we should escape them. And he goes on and says this: "The fourth and most powerful reason for science's reluctance to embrace a theory of intelligent design is also based on philosophical considerations." You know what that means? It's got nothing to do with evidence. It's what they believe to start with. And that's an important part of this lecture I want you to keep at the back of your mind. He says, "Many people, including many important and well-respected scientists, just don't want there to be anything beyond nature. They don't want a supernatural being to affect nature, no matter how brief or constructive the interaction may have been." And you know why that is? Remember what we said at the beginning? In the beginning, God, what's that mean? There's a God who created us. He owns us. We're accountable to Him. In the beginning, the cosmos, what's that mean? It means we're not accountable to anyone but ourselves. And that's really why people don't want to believe in God, despite the evidence. But you know, there's something else here too. As well as the fact that we've got to account for these machines, there's something else that's very important. Where did the information system come from in the first place? Where did the language system come from in the first place that reads our DNA? Well, you know, there's a man in Germany, a professor, Professor Werner Gitt, and he wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information. And I want to read some quotes from Dr. Werner Gitt. Very, very important. He says this: "There is no known law of nature, no known process, no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter." Do you realize what he's saying? What we observe in the real world, in science today, is that there is no mechanism for matter to generate information by itself. It can't happen. And he goes on and says this: "There is no known natural law through which matter can give rise to information, neither is any physical process or material phenomenon known that can do this." In other words, do you know what Dr. Gitt is telling us here? In the real world, what we've observed thus far as scientists is that information only comes from information, previously existing information, and ultimately it has to come from an intelligence. And he says, as far as he's concerned, he's going to make that a law until someone shows him an observation to the contrary. Information only comes from information. So you see, when you put all that together that I've just gone through with you, when those students would come up to me at school and say, "Hey, sir, where did God come from? How do you know there's a God? Who made God?" I would go through all of that with them. What I'm really doing is logically defending that you have to have an intelligence to start with. See, I'd say to Johnny, "Johnny, where did the information come from in ourselves? It would have to come from a greater amount of information. Where would that come from? A greater amount again. Where would that come from? A greater amount again. Where would that come from? A greater amount again." You know the only thing that makes logical sense to me? You start with infinite information. And ultimately, as Dr. Gitt said, information comes from an intelligence. So to me, an infinite intelligence makes sense. In fact, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God is the most scientific statement you could ever make because it fits with real science that we use in the present, our observations in the present. Information comes from information, ultimately from an intelligence. I can't scientifically prove the existence of God to you, Johnny, but I can logically defend, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and it fits with what we observe in the present world. But let me ask you a question, Johnny. What do you believe? Do you believe matter existed eternally? Do you believe matter by itself turned into information systems? Did matter just come about by itself? And then it arranged itself into information systems against everything we observe in science? I'm sorry, Billy, you've got a problem. You see, Billy, you've got a blind faith. You have to believe that something happened opposite to what we observe today. You have to believe that matter generated a code, that matter generated information systems. Whereas, Johnny, I don't have a blind faith. I have a faith that fits the facts of science. I have a faith consistent with what we observe in the real world, that information comes from information. I can logically defend my faith, Johnny. You can't logically defend your faith. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's what fits with our observations in the present world. That makes sense with real science. Johnny, I think you better listen to verse 2. Isn't it exciting being a Christian? It really is, isn't it? Because we can defend our faith. Now, you might say to me, well, look, if it's so obvious there's a God, and Paul in Romans 1 says it's obvious there's a God, why don't people believe that? You know what the Bible tells us? They don't want to believe it. In fact, in 2 Peter 3, Peter says people are willingly ignorant. They deliberately reject the truth. They don't want to believe. You say, but are scientists really like that? Absolutely. You know, sometimes I think we get the wrong idea about things because we think scientists are out there, neutral people searching for truth. You know, the Bible says all of us have a problem. It's called sin. And the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. But let me give you an example. Here's a professor, Richard Lewontin, a Harvard geneticist. So he's a professor at a leading university, secular university in America. And here's what he says. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produces a material explanations, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And now look at this. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. You know what he's saying? I don't care what observations we see that go against what I believe. I don't care how contradictory it is. I'm not going to believe in God. My a priori assumption is materialism. I believe that matter is all it is, all that there is. I don't believe in the supernatural. I believe that matter somehow formed us regardless of the observations out there. I'm not going to believe in God. How is that for a neutral scientist? Isn't that a great example of 2 Peter 3? How men are willingly ignorant of the truth, deliberately reject. Sort of reminds me of the time when the SETI project was in the news a lot, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, searching for life in outer space. You know, I remember quite a number of years ago when somebody in England was listening to outer space and they heard some pulses, 1 1/3 second apart, and they called the source LGM, LGM1. It stood for Little Green Men, because they facetiously thought maybe there's little green men out there because you got this signal from outer space. Well, later on they found out they had been listening to the first pulsar or neutron star. But you know what's fascinating to me? We're listening to outer space for some sort of signal to tell us, you know, that there's some intelligence out there, hopefully. If scientists were to turn their telescopes into microscopes and look at our DNA, you have the most complex information system, signal if you like, or more than a signal. It's an information system, code system that you could ever find in the entire universe, and they look at that and say, chance, 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 and they hear blip, 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 and they say, there's intelligence out there. Something wrong with that, isn't there? I remember in the newspaper at the time, there was an interesting quote